Hey, everybody, welcome to another edition of Spits and Suds on 105.3 The Fan. Thank you so much for making us DFW's favorite hockey podcast. And we got a good one today, folks. Big time stick tap to our following guest on this Spits and Suds quickie, Frank Provenzano. He spent 17 years in NHL front offices where he personally negotiated, this is amazing, over 500 player contracts. Started with the Vancouver Canucks. Then he was the assistant GM for the Washington Capitals, also director of hockey personnel, and then our Dallas Stars. And he was the assistant general manager from 2006 to 2013. He's the pride of oh my God, I can't believe I got that wrong. Sault Ste. Marie. Frank, how are you, buddy?
Sault Ste. Marie.
Sault Ste. Marie. Why did I say?
Marty Turco would
yes.
Those are fighting words for Marty.
Yes.
To get that wrong.
Yes. No, you're absolutely correct. Did you grow up with Marty? Because that's his hometown as well.
I was just a little older than Marty. My younger brother did grow up with Marty, played minor hockey with Marty, same grade. It is a relatively small town, 10 months of winter, 2 months of bad hockey type deal. You know, your typical Canadian small town, it's either a mill or a mine and then a rink.
But some NHLers came out of it. I mean, Ted Nolan's from there. There's a bunch of NHLers from there.
Quite a few NHLers have come out of there, and Kyle Dubas is from there. Not just players, but front office types, because, in Canada, in the United States, you have sports that people are passionate about. Obviously, people are passionate about football here, baseball, basketball. In Canada, hockey is like the thing. And so it draws all the best athletes typically. That's changing a little bit. And so, that was kind of what everyone did.
All right. So before I get into it, I just wanted to give full disclosure. Frank used to be one of our talk hosts on 105.3 The Fan and did a heck of a job and kind of gave us a management perspective. And we loved having him on. But our midday show, the KNC Masterpiece, which Frank was a part of their program, they said, wow, we're excited, but you got to get a Canadian fun fact out of Frank. Now, I did not give you time to prepare for a Canadian fun fact. You and Lindy Ruff were the guys that brought the KNC Masterpiece Canadian fun facts. Do you have one off the top of your head?
Let's see. Off the top of my head, well, I guess a quiz. What do we call a $2 currency unit in Canada?
Ooh. Wow, I've never heard that. What do you call it?
It's a coin, and we call it a toonie.
Really?
So we have a $1 coin called a loonie because there's a loon on it. And then the $2 coin, because we're super imaginative, we called it a toonie.
All right. Wow. And is that like the $2 bill here is more of a souvenir? You don't see it much. Do you see many toonies going around? Like, am I flipping toonies to like
lots
the ballet?
of toonies.
Really?
Yeah. You go to Canada, you end up coming home with a pocket full of, $20 and change because you toonies and loonies. So there's your fun fact.
I was talking to someone the other day and I said, that guy's got good lettuce, and they didn't understand what I was saying. I'm trying to get those Canadian terms down. So when I could talk to the Frank Provenzanos, I feel like I got a little, Canadian blood in me.
Yeah, I have no, I have no lettuce. I just have a side salad.
I'm not far behind, my friends. That's what work does to us. All right. So your dad, I was fascinated reading up on your dad and the influence that he had, not just like with your family, but in the country. I mean, the fact that the Prime Minister of Canada is talking about your dad and how great of a guy he was. Tell me about your dad, because there is the Carmen Provenzano Memorial Cup, which is Sault Ste. Marie, the Thunderbirds, and the Blind River Beavers. So that's named after your dad.
Yeah, and when you drive over the International Bridge from Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, into our town. It throws you onto Carmen's Way, which is a street named after him. He was the member of parliament for Sault Ste. Marie for a number of years, and which is equivalent to a congressman here. He just was real passionate about his community and had a real way with people. In fact, when he was in Ottawa and I was with the Capitals, whenever we'd go into Ottawa, I'd go into watch him in question period, because you have basically, it's kind of like if you ever see in Britain where they have to answer questions before the House of Commons. And so he'd look up at me in the viewing area and, bang on his desk and yell rubbish.
Did he get you into hockey?
No, well, I mean, he got me into hockey in terms of being a hockey dad. But he didn't get me into the management side. But, I have two brothers. We all played. My youngest brother played major junior in Canada. I played Canadian college, and I made up for a lack of size with a lack of speed. So I decided maybe management might be the way to go for me.
I know, but junior B in college, I mean, if you play college here in America, that's big.
Yeah, it was college in Canada is, it's not quite as big as here, but it was still a good level. And it allowed me to play a sport. And then, we would go and play. I went to university in Eastern Ontario, just outside of Toronto. The closest school would be Syracuse University, but we would go down and play the Cornells and the Colgates in preseason, much like in college football here, when you'll have, A&M play Eastern Louisiana State, or, one of those smaller schools. We were the cannon fodder for some of the bigger schools up there to pad their record before their conference games started.
But did your dad, so obviously you get your undergrad and then you're getting your master's from Simon Fraser's University. Did your dad or did you, because in my prep, I saw that you initially thought about going into becoming a doctor, correct?
Yeah. And then I got a job one summer at a hospital, and I was like, yeah, man, everyone's sick. So I thought, well, I changed my major and went into exercise physiology, and it sort of led from there. To be honest, when I finished undergrad, I wanted to go traveling for a year. And so I applied to chiropractic school and business school I applied to chiropractic school in Ontario and business school in BC, and business school was the only one that would let me defer my acceptance so I can go sort of goof off and travel. So
you did. I saw that. Was it New Zealand, Australia?
Yeah, I kind of went all over the place. And I think, then even when I was doing my MBA, I really went out there because I wanted to start skiing. So my whole career was somewhat accidental because, when I was finishing up my MBA, you go to these career nights, and it was like, I work for a bank or work for an investment firm, and it's kind of sounded boring. And so I sort of called the Canucks up on a whim to see if I can get a name for an internship. And the girl was a temp, and it was Lisa Ryan, and we became good friends after that because she ended up working for the Canucks as well. In fact, her husband ended up being the lead guy at the Vancouver Winter Olympics in 2010. Show you how small the hockey world is. But the girl, she put me through to George McPhee, who was the director of hockey operations, now the president of the Las Vegas
Huge name
Golden
in NHL, yeah.
Yeah. And so I was only looking for a name and ended up talking to George. He said, well, can you come in on Monday? So
you had no idea. You had no, you just wanted an internship.
I literally just wanted a name of someone to send literally a resume to, because I was finishing my final semester at business school. And I ended up talking to George and going in, and I didn't realize at the time, I'm going to date myself here, but they were in the process of more or less digitizing their scouting reports. and they didn't have anyone. The hockey departments were much, much smaller back then. All sports departments were, but hockey in particular. And so they had a guy by the name of Dave Nonis, who was on the corporate sales side and who ended up he wanted to get into the hockey side of things. He ended up being the GM in Toronto for a number of years and being an executive in the NHL for a number of years. But he was sort of spearheading this project. And then when he left to go with Brian Burke to go to the NHL front, to the league office, they had no one to finish this project. And I went in and George brought me downstairs. He said, "What do you know about computers?" I lied. I said, "I know a lot about computers." And he brought me downstairs to Mike Penny, who was the director of scouting. And Mike pointed at a file cabinet and he said, "Well, we want to take the information that's in there." And then he pointed at his computer and he said, "We want to put it in here." So that was my first job in hockey.
Wow. Okay. So like my first job in broadcasting, I remember like there was a sign-up sheet for like collared shirts, but you had to buy them. And I was so proud just to be in radio. I bought like 5 of them, and I swear I wore them every day. And I always wondered, like, here's young Frank Provenzano, grew up a hockey fan, played in junior B, and now you're working for the Vancouver Canucks. Like, you have to stay cool, but were you geeking out behind the scenes?
Yeah, and back in the day, it was much more formal. Like it was shirt and tie, and I was a student, living sharing a house with 5 other guys, basically, because we had no money. So I went and bought 2 dress shirts and I think 2 ties, and it was rough because around trade deadline time, we'd all go in the war room, and you had some old school hockey guys like Pat Quinn. I don't know. You must remember Pat.
Yeah, legend. Absolutely.
Yeah. Big Irishman,
Yeah.
You grew up in Boston.
Yep.
Played for the Bruins. He was the guy that, put Bobby Orr out.
Absolutely.
He had to have police escort to get him out of the game.
Yeah.
He was old school and commanded a lot of respect, but he would smoke cigars that were probably as long as my forearm. And it was rough because I only had 2 dress shirts.
And they both smelled like cigars?
Oh, yeah. And then one time I was shredding some stuff, probably scouting reports in the shredder, and I got my tie caught in there. So I was down to 1 tie and 2 dress shirts.
Wow. And it's so funny because you tell these stories behind the scenes, and then when I see the bio, it's like Frank's responsible for bringing analytics to the Vancouver Canucks. So there you go.
Yeah, actually, I went to the IT department. There was a couple of grad students, and the computer science department, I should say. And we literally took an off-the-shelf Microsoft Access. Probably doesn't even exist anymore. And we created a customized version of Microsoft Access when we called it Stanley. And it was on the front end, on the user side, we created so the scouts could input, the stuff we needed. And on the back end, we created different user interfaces. We would track arbitration decisions. This is back in 1997. That's kind of how I ended up following George, because, I sort of by default built that system and was in charge of our data, and then started tracking data. And then one summer I asked George if he needed help with arbitration cases, doing the research. And so I did I think it was Joseph Baranek. I'm pulling some names here.
I like this. He's sharp on the memory.
Joseph Baranek was the arbitration case that year, and I helped him with the research, and I think we did well. And so then he's like, every contract negotiation that he had, he asked if I would be interested in doing the prep, and that was right up my alley. I just started doing more and more of that. He got the GM job in Washington, and took me along. In fact, I was there when I first got to Washington. I was living in George's house.
Wow.
And at the old Landover Center, if you've ever been there, it was in the middle of nowhere. It's actually where the quote unquote new Redskins stadium is, kind of in the middle of nowhere. And the Canucks were coming to play the Caps, and so I was staying at George. So I went in his room and stole one of his ties because he was out of town at a GM's meeting. But he took an early flight to get back because he wanted to see Vancouver. And he gets there about the second period. And I'm sitting there with his tie on. He's like, "Is that my tie?"
Oh, that's so great. And George McPhee is now the big honcho in Las Vegas. Just won a cup with the Knights. So, okay, so he goes to the Caps. Does he leave the Caps, or is he still in the Vancouver offices and says, "Hey, Frank, come in this conference room," and he tells you, "I'm taking the Caps job. Come with me"?
No, he took the job in Washington, and then about 2 weeks or 3 weeks later, he called me and said, "Would you be interested in coming?"
Okay. So now all of a sudden you're in the nation's capital, and you're making your way up the hockey ladder, so to speak. And, not to fast forward, but, there is a pretty special player that the Stars, as we tape this, will play tonight. Alex Ovechkin, going for his 1,500th point. He's 1499. And that's kind of an interesting time because, you're with Washington and you guys have to, I hate to use the word tank, but is that the correct? I mean, you guys want that pick bad. And tell me, when did you first learn about Ovechkin? How about the scouting process and just the management in general? Because I remember listening to Doug Armstrong tell a story about Colton Parayko, where Colton Parayko was playing at a Canadian tournament, and he purposely didn't send any scouts or anyone out there because he didn't want anyone thinking that St. Louis was interested. It was a random tournament in Russia that they sent someone to go see Colton Parayko. So, from the Caps perspective, how did you first learn about Alex Ovechkin and the process as far as getting him?
Well, I mean, the cloak and dagger days of international scouting are pretty much, by that point even, it pretty much ended, where you're, when I was in Vancouver, like Pavel Bure was there and secreting these guys out under cover of darkness or having them defect during World Junior tournaments. Alex Ovechkin, a generational player like Alex Ovechkin, Connor Bedard, for example, Sidney Crosby at the time as well. They're on everyone's radar for two or 3 years out. So there's no surprise. And what was interesting was, we had precipitating, let's call it a reverse engineering our lineup to put ourselves in the best position to get Ovechkin. I can't remember at the time if there was ping pong ball draft or not. We had we had a relatively new owner in Washington, Ted Leonsis, still the owner.
Mm-hmm.
And when Ted bought the team from Abe Poland, he invested significant resources in it, and he wanted to be competitive. And we made the decision 2 years prior to that to get Jaromir Jagr. And, this is at the time, like, not only did we get Jagr, but then we did in fact, I did that deal. It was 7 years, $11 million. So think about that. Like, we were paying $11 million a year to a player in 2000, and they're just getting back to those numbers now. So we had significant money invested in that team, and the on-ice product just wasn't working. Sometimes, you get the ingredients wrong in your cake and it doesn't rise. And this cake wasn't, it was maybe a playoff team, but it wasn't, you could just tell it's not a team that that the pieces work right together. And so we had discussions in the summer leading up to that. I think it was 0304. So it would have been the summer of 2003 on, do we strip this team down? Because there was some good pieces on that team. If you look in that year.
Yeah, Sergei Gonchar was one.
Sergei Gonchar, Hall of Fame. Jaromir Jagr, Hall of Fame. We traded at the time the leading scorer. Think about this. We traded the leading scorer in the National Hockey League from our team that year, Robert Lang. We traded our captain, Steve Konowalchuk. We traded the well, no, I was going to say probably still, but obviously not. At the time, the career goal scoring leader for the Washington Capitals, Peter Bondra.
Some great names.
The space of 2 or 3 months.
Yeah.
And, at the end of the day, it put us in a position to get Alex Ovechkin, and it was franchise altering for that franchise, put them on a path, really to be an elite team for arguably 12 years and a playoff team for what, 15? I don't know, however long Ovechkin's been in the league. Radically changed the profile of the franchise in that city. But when you're making that decision on the front end, it's tough because, you're not just, these aren't just players. These are, if you truly build a team culture, then it's not just words, it's relationships. That's what team culture is when you boil it all down. It's the strength of relationships that you have within the organization and trust. When you boil it all down, a lot of times culture comes down to trust, and there's an implicit trust on the player side that you're going to do everything you can to make the team that they're on as competitive as possible so that they have the best chance of team success and individual success, because they have a finite career and you don't want to waste years of anyone's career. And it's a hard decision to make because there's no guarantee that you're going to end up with Alex Ovechkin. You might end up with the second pick in that year's draft or the third. And however good that player is, and offhand, I don't know, it's probably not Alex Ovechkin.
Yeah. And that's old school time when letters were still popular. Did you receive a lot in your office prior to the Ovechkin pick?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, and, you talk about letters, like it's also you're trading letters off your team. I remember we were working, the first trade we made was Steve Konowalchuk, heart and soul guy.
Yeah.
The reason he wasn't the most talented, but he had the C on there for a reason, because he was like the epitome of just an honest 200-foot player. And we were working on a trade. George was working on a trade, and sometimes these trades take, longer than you'd like. And so we had a game in Ottawa, and he stayed back in Washington, and I got on the plane to go to Dallas. And then I got the call as soon as we landed from George that the trade had been consummated. And probably one of the hardest things I did in my career was pull Steve Konowalchuk off the plane and tell him that he had been traded to Colorado, and that he wasn't joining his teammates on the bus back to the hotel. But it was even worse than that he'd been traded, and that once we got to the hotel, we were going to pull his bag off the bus and get him in a cab and go back to the airport, because I got the call on the bus ride to the hotel. And you could just feel the anger and the hurt from his teammates, legitimately.
Yeah.
Because those relationships were meaningful there on that team. It was a close team. And
did he tell his players on the bus?
No, I had to pull them off the bus as they were getting off the bus to go to the hotel and tell them he'd be traded.
Okay. So he didn't interact with his teammates after that.
Well, and then, he's got like 10 minutes to say goodbye to everyone. Like it was rough. And it's not the ideal way you want it to go down, but sometimes you just don't control the life cycle of a trade.
Hmm.
Not sometimes, oftentimes,
Yeah.
because there's another dance partner, and you're finalizing the assets, moving back and forth, and sometimes there's medical records need to be reviewed. And I'm not saying there was in this case, but my point being, like, it's sort of become fanciful now for people to say we should blow it up, we should tear it down, and there's reasons you don't want to get stuck in the mushy middle. And it was, at the end of the day, was the right move for the Washington Capitals.
Yeah.
But the human cost of that is real when you're doing it, and it sucks. It sucks not having a competitive team, because all your work, all the hours that the scouts are spending, you're spending, is in a way almost celebrated when you have a game.
Yeah.
Because that is the end result of everyone's work product. And to have a team that you are almost engineering to not be competitive, it just goes against everyone's kind of fiber of how they even got to the positions that they're in. So, was it the right business decision? Yes. There's always the sense too that you may be tearing this down for the next person who sits in your chair to reap the reward.
Yeah, and McPhee ends up leaving.
Well, he didn't leave right away.
Okay, but he left.
Oh, he was there a good long time.
Okay, but you decided, right? You took a little break, and how tough was that? Because here you are, you've worked your way up to a guy who had 2 ties, one shredded, to all of a sudden being the general manager's right-hand guy and being really involved in the team, and then kind of taking a step back from something that you've worked really hard to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things, I guess. One is I got engaged to be married during that time, and I knew deep down that because I was privy, doing the contracts. I was privy not only to do the contracts, but I did the budgets, and the numbers, the economics didn't work at that time in the National Hockey League. And I was pretty sure that it was going to be a protracted fight and probably result in the cancellation of the season. And my wife and I were getting married that October. And so I just didn't want to have to go in and pretend to have stuff to do for 8 months when there's just nothing to do,
Yeah.
And probably goes back to, where we started this, and that there wasn't a lot of advanced planning in my career. Like,
but that's what I love about you. That's it. Because so you do that, you end up getting married, and then
and we went traveling.
Yeah.
The long and short of it is we went traveling.
More traveling. I mean, people are listening right now and they're super jealous. They're like, all right, this guy has been in like the NHL for years, and yet he still gets to go to New Zealand, Australia. I don't know where you went this second time around when you got married. I'm jealous sitting in, like, I'm watching you and I'm getting like fired up. Like,
well, the league, everything shut down in September, and we were getting married in October. So I had the bright idea that in between that and getting married, I would go climb Kilimanjaro.
Jeez.
So
Wow.
I did that, which my wife, to her credit, probably had some misgivings about, but she let me go.
Wow.
And then we got married, and then we went and traveled in South Africa for 2 months, and then we went and lived in Italy for 4 months.
That's absolutely amazing. So then how do you connect with the Dallas Stars?
Well, so we came back, and I had kind of been kicking around the idea of maybe moving on, because as great as my relationship was with George, I personally felt that maybe people saw me as just George's guy and not my own guy, if that made any sense. Probably even didn't make sense, but that's how I felt. And then my dad ended up passing away suddenly, going back to my dad. And so I went back up to Sault Ste. Marie to help my mom out. As you mentioned, the prime minister came and gave his eulogy. In fact, I went up and spoke after him, and the mood obviously especially if a sudden passing is heavy. And so my opening line was, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for being my opening act.
Good.
Lighten it up a little, I guess.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I decided, it was actually one of the harder calls I made, was to call George and tell him I didn't think I was going to come back.
Hmm.
To this day, I mean, George just sent me a picture 2 days ago or 2 weeks ago of his first grandchild. Like, he and
Wow.
I are close to this day. They're in town here this weekend. Probably try and make it to that game. I mean, I love the guy,
Yeah.
and
And
I
not
was
to
so
not to fast
happy.
forward, Frank, but when he lands in Vegas and is creating that project, was there talks of you maybe going to Vegas?
Um, Not really,
Yeah.
because by that point, I was one of the things for me when you're in any sport, you can't be half in it. And we were established here, and you know, it's hard to balance family and a professional sports job. And I just kind of wanted to, I got to the point in my life, outside of being a general manager myself, I had done most everything, outside of title. And I just kind of I didn't want to not be around for my kids. So it never really got anything serious.
So what was your impression when you came to Dallas and, settled in, became the assistant general manager? That was an interesting time in Dallas history as far as hockey.
Yeah, well, I loved it here when we first got here. You know, it was a team that I was excited to come to, because when I was in Washington, we'd often look at the Dallas Stars and be like, wow, you know, imagine what it'd be like to have money to spend like that.
Yeah.
And then I got here, and Doug Armstrong brought me in, and then my second year, Doug was let go, and then we had the process sort of had started too of you know the looking to cut costs because of some financial issues in the bigger Hicks sports empire, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah.
Some of that may have had to do with their acquisition of Liverpool. I'm not
Yeah.
sure. Um, and then it was the uh, Brett Hull, Les Jackson uh, dual GM experiment, and then they brought in Joe Newendijk, and then when they brought in Joe Newendijk, almost right after that, we went into a prolonged period of bankruptcy,
Yeah.
and I don't recommend being a front office executive for a bankrupt team.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. What was it like working with Brett Hull? Let's start with him.
Well, Brett's a really uh, Brett's really intelligent, and he, sometimes I think he comes off as really funny, which he is, but he's also really intelligent. He really knows, like, he's an intelligent guy and he's a really smart hockey guy. But, the challenge of that, of anybody coming in when you haven't sat in those chairs or worked your way up, is you probably think it's easier than it is, because you don't know what you don't know. And you've got no scar tissue built up, and then you make a few mistakes and you start to build up some scar tissue, and it's hard to get rid of those
Yeah.
mistakes. They kind of hang around.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, absolutely. And I wanted to ask you because, you worked for arguably two of the great Dallas Stars of all time, even though they weren't here for long. Like, they always said about Larry Bird in the NBA, it's tough sometimes to play for elite athletes because they're expecting the same out of you, and sometimes you can't deliver. Did you ever see that from Newendijk or Hull?
I think maybe more Brett in the sense that, you know, when you're at the level, I mean, Brett was a superstar in his playing
Yeah.
days,
And a celebrity around town.
and a celebrity around town, you know, and scored the goal, you know, toe in the crease, Stanley Cup, the only Stanley Cup in franchise history. And I think, you know, and he's best friends with Wayne Gretzky, who was at the time involved with Arizona. And I think, you know, there's a common thread sometimes, like you say, this is just my observation, and that players at that level don't understand how players don't understand. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I was pausing to think about it. Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't make sense to players like that, like why lesser players can't do some things or do some of the things that they do.
Yeah.
Because they just play the game. You know, for Brett Hull to score that many goals, you see the game differently.
Yeah.
At a different speed. You just process information. And by the way, like, you know, you talk about scouting. My experience was the biggest delta was never, if you go, you know, watch a practice or a morning skate, it'll be harder for the average person to watch that and be like, those are the best players, because the difference between everyone's skating ability isn't that great. The difference between everyone's shot isn't that great. There's a difference, obviously, between the best players and lesser players. But the real difference, in my opinion, is the ability to process information under duress. That's what sets the great players from, you know, the wins above replacement, the guys with the higher WAR.
Yeah.
Are the guys with the better computer chips.
You know, I've watched a lot of AHL hockey, and one word that I use is consistency, because if you put Dallas Stars sweaters on Texas Stars players, I mean, some people would notice, but a lot of people couldn't tell, you know, because the American League has just become such a great league. But just the consistent guys that night after night can do it are the ones that, you know, get the call-ups. Did want to talk, because in the middle of this whole bankruptcy, tough spending times, you guys pulled off one heck of a trade with Tampa hours before the trade deadline, and wanted to kind of get a behind the scenes, acquiring Brad Richards with Johan Holmquist. Always good to get a goalie there. And you gave up a good young goaltender in Mike Smith. I remember watching Mike Smith, and you know, Turco was kind of teaching him, you know, how to play with the stick and good puck handling skills. So you gave up him, a very smart player, and Jeff Halpern, who's currently the assistant in Tampa, and Jussi Jokinen, who was a popular player, good on the shootouts, and a fourth. So it was a big deal. Gave up a 4th-round pick, but Brad Richards came in tough times and really didn't get the notoriety I think he deserved, but was a heck of a player in Dallas.
Well, we weren't bankrupt at that point.
Right. It was like, was it like fringe, like not being able to spend a lot of money, or?
No, that was still the Brad Hull, Les Jackson era. That was kind of the last year before the cost cutting really took effect. Okay. And, you know, in that case, Brad had I believe he had a full no trade. And so, you know, it did give us some leverage in the sense that, you know, that their ability to freely market him around the league was limited by the player and his agent. But yeah, that was a great trade, you know, and then we weren't able to re-sign Brad because of the bankruptcy and where we were heading. But we did bring him in and went on a run to the conference finals that year and lost to Detroit.
Yeah. Yeah. That was a very good Detroit team. That was a tough one.
In fact, he came in, we went on a bit of a run, and then I think to end the season, we actually had a bit of a losing streak, and and dropped a couple of spots in the playoff seeding. But he was a great player for us. I mean, that was a good hockey team,
Mm-hmm. All right.
and we
So,
had,
yeah.
go ahead.
Well, in 2008, we had the Sean Avery incident as well. And I just wanted to get your take, being in management, looking at the time, Sean Avery chirping and makes all the headlines. And now all of a sudden the Dallas Stars are in national news for the wrong reasons. And take us through that situation, and how you guys went about the decision, how the NHL was involved as far as the suspension. Just an interesting time in Dallas Stars history.
Let me get my memory cap on here. That was the year after we went to the conference finals. That was the summer where we acquired Sean. I think he was an unrestricted free agent. My memory serves.
Yeah. And the other player involved was Dino Phaneuf.
Yeah. And, he's a player, obviously, that played around the line, right? He was an agitator type player.
Absolutely.
He was a skilled player.
Yes. I always thought he was really good with the Kings, and I know there was a relationship with Hull from him coming up with the Red Wings.
Yeah. And when you play around that line, sometimes you cross over it. And, in that case, in that season, there were probably a couple instances, not probably, there were instances where he crossed over the line in a way that wasn't acceptable. I'm not sure he was he was suspended, but then I also vaguely remember that
it was a 6-game suspension and completing a counseling program.
That's right. He was in that the player assistance program, and that's a confidential program. So what made it tough to manage is we didn't know. It's totally confidential. And so we really didn't know what his status was and when he would be coming out of that program. Refresh my memory if you have it in front of you, because I don't. Did we end up trading him that year?
Waivers.
That's right. And so, but I don't think we could put him on waivers until he cleared that program.
Yes, that's correct.
So, speaking of one of the more interesting things you're managing, that was definitely one where you're trying to manage scenarios, but you have no idea on timeline.
Yeah.
And there's also salary cap implications involved, because not only is there a salary cap, there's also a floor. You have to hit a certain amount to get to the floor. In fact, when we were bankrupt, I'm sort of jumping around, but we picked up Eric Nystrom.
Yep.
And
played really well here.
I believe at the time, if you picked up someone on re-entry waivers, meaning they had been sent down in the minors, and they were coming from the minors back up to the NHL, it would be 50% of their salary. You could claim that on a cap charge. We had to have them recall him and then put him back on waivers, because we couldn't recall him on re-entry, claim him off re-entry waivers, because it didn't put us at the floor.
That was a great pickup, because Nystrom came here, played well, and then you guys traded him for Matthias Janmark, or got Matthias.
Oh, he played really well for us.
Yeah.
I mean, I say I don't recommend managing a bankrupt team, but on the flip side, it was some of the best work I've been involved with, both personally and as a group, because you had to try and compete with severely less resources, right? Because the mandate was not, don't be a bad team. The mandate was be as competitive as you can, because we're trying to sell this team. from the creditors.
Yeah.
And, if you remember, like, we were right in the playoff mix for a couple of years there, being at the floor and being bankrupt.
That is a tough time. I do remember
We,
that. And you had to get NHL approval with every move, correct?
yeah. I remember having a conference call with some bankers out of New York at like 5 a.m. when we, in order to get approval for the overage on our approved budget to bring in Jamie Langenbrunner, the trade deadline.
And I guess the
He was
question,
asking me, some banking guy, and he was asking me if I think this was going to win us the cup. I'm like, well, I hope we're going to get us in the playoffs.
All right. And then in 2010, you guys had a brutal decision where your franchise face, who in March will get a trophy at the American Airlines, a well-deserved trophy, right near Dirk Nowitzki, Mike Modano, being traded away. Take us through that process, because, I mean, one thing, what you guys did with the Capitals in order for the final piece to get Ovechkin, which was a franchise changer, you're going through economic times, and then you have a player, and I think, Modano would admit probably a bit on his downside of his career, but still an icon in town, someone that was the ambassador for hockey in DFW.
Yeah, legacy players are tough, because they're legacy players for a reason. They're iconic. I shouldn't say they're tough. They're challenging to most times, in my opinion, to manage on the downside, at the end, in the twilight, whatever you want to call it, because they're icons. Mike Modano deservedly is going to get a statue in front of the American Airlines Center, because he was a great ambassador for hockey in the state of Texas. Who knows if the Dallas Stars are where they are today? I would argue they would not be where they are today in the sort of position they have in the Dallas sports landscape if Mike Modano was not part of the group that came here from Minnesota.
Yeah.
And so you want to respect the legacy, but you also have a job to do on the management side for the now and the future. And sometimes with a legacy player, those start to separate, and the amount of discussions that we had on how to manage that internally, were, there's a lot of discussions on how to respect that, but how to do what we needed to do to also move the franchise forward, given where we were in our financial situation, given where we were in our competitive life cycle, and given where Mike was. And it was hard.
Yeah. Yeah. Mike wanted to stay.
I can't even really remember.
Okay.
To be honest, I'm not. Did we trade him, or we just didn't re-sign him? I thought we just didn't re-sign him, and he signed with Detroit as a free agent.
Well, you had to throw that question back at me. That's the thing about this interview. Frank Provenzano is throwing stuff back at me to do my
my recollection is that
he was not re-signed. Did not re-sign, which I guess is better than a trade.
Yeah, and so in some ways it was a different discussion,
Yeah.
Still a tough one, because at the end of the day, the also, like, an iconic player like Mike on the sort of the farewell tour. Like, look at, we were talking about Alex Ovechkin, right? And look at sort of where the Capitals are. They're trying to maintain their competitive window so that Alex is on at least a playoff competitive team. I don't think anyone would argue that Washington is an elite Stanley Cup contending team anymore, even people in Washington. But they're trying to maintain their competitive window so that as Alex chases the record, he's not doing it on a team that's also trying to get the first overall pick. And we just financially were not in that situation here. And so that wrinkle made it hard. When he finally did decide to retire a star, I do remember doing the contract at $999,999.99 and registering that with the league for one day.
All right. So that same year, and take us inside what it's like for the NHL draft, because one of my favorite stories with you is you guys had a high first round draft pick. I remember I was watching that draft. I remember the player that I wanted who was dropping in that draft. That player was Cam Fowler, because I felt as though the Stars needed a bigger defenseman, and everything I saw, he looked amazing. And dropping down, and here come the Stars, and I'm like, wow, we're going to have a chance at Cam Fowler. And then the Stars announce their pick, and it's goalie Jack Campbell. So were you at the draft, or were you back? And take us through that scenario.
I was at the draft.
Okay.
And
did you guys expect expect Fowler to drop like that?
Well, typically when you put your list together, most teams that I've been a part of, goalies are always different, right? And a lot of times goalies get slotted in to a draft. They're not necessarily part of your overall list, but you have your overall list and then your sort of your goalie list. And where do you if you have a goalie that you believe you think your scouts obviously think very highly of relative to other draft classes or relative to his class, where do you slot that goaltender, and how much of a differentiator is he? And our amateur scouts, and at the time our head amateur scout was a former goaltender, was obviously very high on Jack Campbell. And so that decision was made, I believe, on the draft floor, and I wasn't at that side of the table, so I don't know any of the discussions that went on. But those are sometimes the decisions that you have with goaltenders, is where to slot them, and they did decide to slot him in above Fowler.
Okay,
but it was a spirited debate, which you have in those situations. If you go back, and would you do it again? Probably not. Jack ended up having a decent career in the NHL, but obviously full of ups and downs. He's an athletic, at the time he was a very athletic goaltender, and athletic goaltenders, in my experience, can be great, but they can go into periods where they struggle because, they rely on their athleticism. Rick DiPietro was a good example of an athletic goaltender.
Yeah. Wow. He is terrific in college.
And, up and down NHL career, injuries ended his career.
Yeah.
But that is sort of the goalies are risky, right? And it's risk reward. And if you look at, that's why they don't usually go in the first round. But if you look at the current first round pick in the Stars net, I think you'd do that all day, right?
Yeah. That turned out to be a good one. Yeah.
You just, and they take longer to bake. They're a souffle instead of a pie.
Yep. Yeah. All right. Another one I wanted to talk about was James Neal and Matt Niskanen to Pittsburgh for Alex Goligoski.
Part of that was at the time also making money work, I believe.
Okay.
In terms of the construction of it?
Well, I felt, I mean, real deal Neil had a great career as Matt Niskanen went on to win a cup. Goligoski at the time, I will say, coming from Pittsburgh, like he was known as a really, really good NHL defenseman. I don't think he was bad with Dallas. Um, I think there were times that he was really good, and he's still in the league.
He's
So
still in the league, and the thing with Goose is that I think he was locally, in terms of the local fan base, his their perception of him was tainted by the fact of what was given up for him.
yeah,
And in retrospect, probably too steep, you know. But he was a guy that no matter which coaches came in would play him 26 minutes a night. And like you say, he's still in the league. He was a very good defenseman, and they're just harder to find defensemen like that. And like I said, in retrospect, probably should have gotten a little more back, even if it's in terms of futures in that deal. But the decision was made that was he was going to fill a need for us, and he did.
mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
I don't really know if I'm answering your question.
No, that's fine. I'm just throwing things out because I think Stars fans kind of love pulling back the curtain and say, "Oh, what about this trade? What about this?"
Yeah, I mean, the thing about trades is, when a trade is made, it's probably been precipitated by at least 2 to 6 weeks of discussions and evaluations.
Yeah.
And various iterations. And so, sometimes the final product right at that last mile, you've gone down the road for so long, and sometimes it gets tweaked at the end. And sometimes those tweaks in retrospect were an overcorrection.
Yeah. And similar to the oddity of situations like the Sean Avery where you're not expecting it. We were kind of discussing before this about a defenseman, Carlos Skraskins, who is a terrific shot blocker, and he was coming off injury, but of all things, a collision in pregame skate with Matt Niskanen. Was there any behind the scenes kind of things that we don't know about that?
Oh my gosh. So it was in Chicago, and Mark Crawford was the coach, and Joe and I happened to be both on the road that game, I believe. And so Carlos, everyone that came in contact with Carlos Skraskins just loved him because he was just, he was probably like a lineman in football, where he just all the dirty work, shot blocking, penalty killing, just a great guy. He would have a habit of the last few laps of his, when everyone comes on the ice and skates around, he would turn around and skate backwards, like rip around the ice a couple times backwards. And I guess he did that, and Matty Niskanen was skating forwards and he was skating backwards, and in warm-up, and nobody really saw this, they collided.
Oh.
And like full on, like Niski took a full dose of Carlos Skraskins. I think, his back of his helmet to the face or whatever. And so Joe and I are up watching the game, and then we end up getting a penalty, and we're looking, and we're like, something doesn't look right. And we only got like one of our defensemen took a penalty. So then they're rotating, and they're only rotating like 3 defensemen. I'm like, why are they shortening the bench on a penalty kill? And then we're like, wait a second. You sort of count, and you can always sort of tell, because you sit up top when you're the away management team, and you kind of look down, and there's too much spacing on our bench. Like there's too many gaps for one guy in the penalty box. And we're like, hold on, like you start counting and you're like, where is everybody? and and so at the intermission, we sent someone downstairs and we're like, where's Scratch and Niski? And they had collided, and it was just like our trainer at the time, well, it's still the trainer there, Dave Zeiss. He was getting ready to go out, and all of a sudden, Matt Niskanen, comes walking in. I think he's bleeding. And then he's like, what happened? And then Carlos Scratchtons comes walking in, and he's like dazed and confused. And then it's a bit chaotic, and you're trying to figure out what happened because the game hasn't even started yet. And then you got to let the coaches know that you're down 2 defensemen.
Wow.
Right before the game, where there's no chance to get anyone else dressed. It was a bit of a fire drill. It was the first time I had seen 2 guys go down in the pregame warm-up from friendly fire.
Yeah.
And not really know about it.
All right, 500 contracts negotiated. Must have been some interesting conversations with agents and players. What's one of your favorite stories as far as a contract negotiation?
Oh boy, there were so many of them.
All right. Is there any oddities that would be like, are you serious?
What's interesting is a lot of people assume that when you're doing contract negotiations, it's very adversarial. But the truth is, anyone can get one deal done, but you're dealing in an ecosystem, especially with free agency and with salary cap. A lot of it comes down to recruitment. So you have to have these relationships with agents that are in some ways collaborative, right? Because they have to trust you that you're not going to force a deal on them that's going to make them lose their clients. So you end up having relationships with agents that maybe from a perception standpoint, it's not as adversarial as you would think necessarily. And so I remember I had one salary arbitration case, and we actually went to the hearing in Toronto, and we ended up settling on, literally on the courthouse steps. And then one of the agents on the other side was like, hey, do you want to grab dinner tonight? And I was like, sure. And so he and I went out in Toronto, and then we got invited. He knew a friend of his. He knew a friend of his that was having a party or something. And so we had nothing to do. And so we got invited to this party, and it just ended up being one of those nights where you're sort of going from party to party with people you don't even know. And we ended up on like this rooftop balcony at like 2 a.m. at a hotel overlooking the rest of Toronto. And we're like, this is just the strangest night that I thought I'd had, where I didn't think it would start there this morning when we were literally fighting on the courthouse steps over, $300,000 in arbitration. And then he ended up 2 a.m. having drinks at a hotel. It was the strangest end to a contract, to a salary arbitration I'd ever been a part of, for sure.
There are a lot of people out here that negotiate their own salary. And as a person who does a lot of negotiating, any tips for them?
Yeah, I would say, as long as you're just, it's like anything else, listen more, speak less sometimes, and really try and hear what the other side is saying. I always tried to determine what was a want and what was a need. I would try and meet their needs as long as my needs were met, and split the wants.
Okay. That's real good. All right. So finally, quick analytic question. So I'm still a big fan of plus minus. And it's similar to like batting average in baseball, where, I just get tired of people batting 220, and it seems as though it's shifting. Whereas batting average now, people want, well, he gets on base. On base percentage is big. How do you feel about plus minus, time on ice? And for the people that watch Stars games and want to dive into an analytic, what would you suggest as far as, because, like, for instance, I'm guessing Pat Maroon does not score well in the analytics department. But at the same time, why does that player go from team to team and they tend to win cups? So, take us through a management perspective as far as what you always like to and what you continue to, what you enjoy for analytics, what you follow, and, how do you toe that line between good room guy, quality analytics?
Yeah, I always thought plus minus, was instructive at the, sort of one or two standard deviations from the mean, at the ends, at the extremes, plus minus would tell you this guy is pretty bad or pretty good. It was less instructive in the middle, in the mushy middle. And I think that's the case in a flow game like hockey, in a flow game like, uh, you know, in a flow game like hockey or even football, where a lot of the value is spatial. Where is someone who doesn't have the football? Where is someone who doesn't have the puck relative to a situation? It's a little more nuanced. And so I think, the truth is now there's so much more data available, even in the last 2 years, especially internally to teams, than there ever was back when I was doing it. And there's much more information now available to fans, but they're just getting kind of the tip of the iceberg. But there is value in someone's being, the old school words. He's a glue guy, good guy in the room. The pitfall for that is you overpay for it sometimes and overvalue it. But the value is real. It's not zero, and it just has to fit in what you're doing. And at the end of the day, I think, if you're going to sort of focus on stats, they do have the play driving stats, expected goals and stuff like that, which I think they have value. But you also have to keep in mind the situations that player is playing in, because not all situations are created equal, and coaching staffs are rational, and they're trying to put, some of the players they're putting in tougher situations than others. You're going to put your best troops in the toughest warfare,
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the eye test for me when you're looking at a lot of these stats, which can also become noise, is just keep in mind the context that these numbers are being generated in. Is this player playing, is he being trotted out there for offensive zone faceoffs way more than defensive zone faceoffs, for example? Where at what point in the game is he out there? Is he out there against the team's top line, or is he being sheltered against the team's third line? That has a lot to do with your numbers as well, in terms of context.
I know one of your big things in life was to capture a cup. Does it still enter your mind at all? I know you're past the hockey days and you're very successful in what you're doing now. Tell us what you're doing now.
That's my regret.
Yeah.
But I did 17 years and never got my name on it.
Yeah.
And, do you spend another 10?
Right.
At a point, the desire to get my name on that thing, is it a regret? 100%. I would love to have my name etched on the Stanley Cup. The closest I've come is when Washington won, they invited me to their Stanley Cup party. And then when Tampa won, Jeff Halpern, who's still a friend, in fact, I still have a toe in the hockey world, because I'm part of a group that represents NHL coaches. And, closest I got to the cup was just having a few pictures holding it. And at this point, that's what it's going to be. And that's good enough. And now I just root for people that I have relationships with to get their names on it. When George won it last summer, it felt to me almost like I won it.
Sure.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
And I'd love for the Stars, to win it this year, because there's still a lot of people there that I care about, quite frankly.
Yeah. Well, my friend, I know you're busy, but I'd love to grab a couple of toonies and head down to Tim Hortons and grab a brew. What do you think?
We're getting a Tim Hortons
in Dallas.
I think so. I I think we're getting a Tim Hortons. I swear somebody texted that to me.
Wow. Wow.
We'll have to do these podcasts at Tim Hortons. You'll have to.
God. Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I'm jealous when I watch Hockey Night in Canada and I see those commercials. That's pretty unbelievable. That's what I love about hockey is the randomness too. When I was down in Houston, there was a pub in downtown Houston, of all places, called the Maple Leaf Pub. And it had a penalty box in it, and they played Hockey Night in Canada, and every beer on tap was Canadian.
Yeah.
In the middle of Houston, Texas. And I used to just go there, and I was like, wow, I felt at home, and, they'd have Arrows watch parties when the Arrows were in town, and I was like, boy, that's so random. So to get a Tim Hortons, I know we got Moxies now.
Yeah. So
we're getting a little Canada down here.
And you got Maple Leaf Diner up my way. Oh,
yeah, that's right. Is that where you get your poutine?
Yeah, it absolutely is. Every once in a while. Yeah, I go there for breakfast on occasion and sub in fries with gravy and cheese curd.
Well, my friend, your dad will be proud. And I will call you Dr. Frank from now on. So, and thank you for taking the time. I know Spits and Suds fans really appreciate this. Thank you for your honest and open conversation, because there are so many stories from the Stars past that I think, and that's what I love about having Craig on the pod, is I wonder what happened, and now we have the forum to get the answers. So truly, truly appreciate you taking the time, and look forward to catching up with you again soon, my friend.
Yeah, let's do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Frank Provenzano on a Spits and Suds one-timer. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We truly appreciate your support, and we'll be back with another Spits and Suds episode soon.